Good morning. Welcome. CSEP, and since there are many new faces here today, I will definitely try and introduce a little bit about CSEP, and I can see many of you as students. So that's all the more. So CSEP is a multidisciplinary, independent, non-political, scholarship-oriented, and evidence-driven think tank. We have 100+ scholars, 10+ areas working on spaces starting from foreign policy, energy, climate change and sustainability, mining, macroeconomics, trade, manufacturing, urban issues, health, education, technology, and I might have missed a few, but broadly we cover a whole range of areas. Inclusion, sustainability, global south are kind of running themes across most of our work. Our work is, as I said, heavily evidence-driven, and it looks at almost all facets of this whole growth, sustainability, inclusion, and of course the geoeconomic and geopolitical trade-offs. I think one of the most interesting conversations that's happening these days is that started off by Anant, it seems, on this issue of why are firms not paying enough. And I think he got really one part of the story, and I think it's an interesting one, that you have had such a massive rise in profitability over the last few years, but almost no rise in wages. But I think the more interesting question is, how come during a time of such volatility, you had such a major rise in profitability? And that also only amongst the large firms, and less so, or perhaps not so, amongst the smaller firms. I thought it would have been nice if Anand had also motivated this question. I think that these are the kind of questions that are really important for us to look at going forward. I do myself, I'm quite really interested in this space. And one of the things that's really been happening is technologies. I mean, there have been major changes in technologies. Today, at least globally, we have supermassive firms. These firms are providing a whole range, a bouquet of services and products. They are providing public goods, and they have the power to exclude you from these. So essentially, these are like semi-state. This is one class of firms, and there you can perhaps understand it's technology that is driving it. I do wonder, does complexity drive the size of firms, especially in India, which you have the stories of Inspector Raj is there, of course, legal delays are there, and the complexity of policy. Does that drive? And again, there was some literature in it. Unfortunately, as we were talking about it, in India at least, it doesn't seem to have grown. And today's conversation will add a little bit to it. I also wonder, does government policy drive large businesses? I mean, there is this conversation on kiritsus and chai balls, and perhaps even the Indian government is supporting some large groups. But I think there's more to it than that, because if you look at public sector firms, even the public sector firms have been growing in size, scale, and scope. So there is more to it. It seems that this modern state prefers to deal with larger firms. But again, these are open questions. We really don't have answers to that. I'm very glad that this area is of interest to you, Simon. And we have worked many years in the many years back. It was a pleasure then, and it's a pleasure now to have you here.
Thank you.
I will take some time and introduce the panelists. Simon Commander is the managing partner of Altura Partners, which provides strategic and economic policy advice to decision makers in government and companies in emerging economies. He's also at the IE Business School in Madrid and Independent Economics in London. He was the senior advisor at both the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development between 1998 and 2011, and before that at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. He holds an MA from Oxford University and a PhD from Cambridge. His latest book, The Connections World, The Future of Asian Capitalism, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. Welcome.
Thank you.
Naveen Joseph Thomas, I have introduced him here before as well, but let me again welcome you here. As has over a decade of teaching experience, he's the associate professor and dean and the associate dean for the program strategy and academic affairs at the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. His current research focuses on industrial policy and labor economics, including the big business groups and market structures in India, the multi-plant phenomenon in the Indian manufacturing sector, evaluating the impact of deregulation of labor laws, the man-made fiber segment of Indian textile and apparel industry, and the electronics industry. He holds a PhD in economics from the Department of Economics, Delhi School. He received his MSc from the Terry School of Advanced Studies and a discussant and has been working in this space for some time now. Our next discussant is Payal Malik. She is a public policy economist and a visiting professor at ICRIER. Her areas of expertise are competition law, policy, digital markets, antitrust litigation, technology policy, and economic regulation of network industries. She has been the head of economics at the Competition Commission of India, where she played a key role in advising the CCI on the economics of competition law. She was a convener of the working group on New Age Economy and Big Data constituted by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. She was also a member of the task force of the government formulating the e-commerce policy of India and a member of the Committee on Digital Competition Law. Welcome, Payal.
Thanks.
Shishir Gupta is a senior fellow at CSEP. His work focuses on many aspects of the Indian economy, including economic growth, governance and institutions, urbanization, subnational reforms, among others. Before joining CSEP, Shishir was a fellow with the McKinsey Global Institute for 14 years, where he led multi-ethnic teams in India and the US on policy research and client studies across multiple domains. He has written widely on these topics in MGI reports and research papers, as well as popular media. He is an economist by education with an MA and MPhil from the Delhi School of Economics. Shishir, may I now hand over?
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And welcome Simon, Naveen and Payal to join us on this very important topic. Like Laveesh, I'm also deeply interested personally. I've done some work, but looking forward to the discussion today. So may I request Simon and Naveen to take us through the presentation?
Okay. Can the slideshow be put up?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, come on. Thanks.
And you will take around 20-25 minutes?
Yes, no
Cool.
longer than that.
Cool. Thanks.
So thank you very much, Laveesh and Shishir, for your kind welcome. And it's great to be here again amongst friends and to be able to present this at CSEP. So this is a paper that Naveen and I, with our friends and colleagues, Saul and Barun, have been working on really quite hard for the last year and a bit, not least of all because of the data challenges. It's a paper that, in a sense, I think revives interest in competition, which has waned in recent years, not just in India, but also in the region. And as Laveesh just mentioned right now, we think it's extremely relevant, both from a public policy perspective, but also from an analytical perspective. And indeed, maybe in the discussion, I would say I'm prepared to, would hazard that it's not just relevant in India, it's actually relevant in most countries across Asia, where you get very large business groups and very large accumulations in markets across the world. So let me go through, across Asia, that is. So let me go through the motivation for the paper. So I think we can see, it's going to be reversed, of course, by Trump, that in the States in the last few years, in Europe particularly, the Commission has pushed forward an agenda for looking at the accumulation of market power. Now, of course, much of it is driven by the role of network industries in particular, and the accumulation through technology and other means of very substantial market positions. But it's a broader interest there. And so antitrust policy, competition policy, whatever you wish to call it, has moved much more center pace. Now, as I said, I think in the States it's going to be rolled back, undoubtedly, and that's a great pity, but I don't see the Commission rolling back on that. In Asia, I think it's fair to say that competition policy has gone into not a long sleep, but at least perhaps a period of less activism than one might expect, given, as we shall see, the developments in markets over the last 50, 60 years. Now, the difference, of course, between the US or the UK, for that matter, and large bits of Asia, including India, is, in a sense, the role of business groups in the economy. These business groups, there's a whole literature to which Saul and I have contributed and the like, which attributes the significant weight that they have in to the political connections. But of course, there's a wider literature which argues that most of these business groups got formed in periods where capital and labor market imperfections were so strong that it really made an awful lot of sense to internalize it within the group itself. And there's plenty of argument about that. People like Tarun Khanna at HBS and the like have made these arguments quite powerfully. So in a sense, market failures drove the formation of business groups. That's the argument. But it's an argument that I think is questionable because, of course, market failures over time have become less. And yet at the same time, not only do we see business groups continuing, but actually entrenching. And as our paper will show, they're not only just entrenching, they're growing and diversifying even further. Now, just to put this in context, and also to put the Indian numbers in context, just simple measure of revenues of the top 5 and 10 firms to GDP, they range from between 10, 12%, China and the like, to about 40%, which is Korea and Vietnam. So these are really large magnitudes. If you look at the so-called OECD, you'd be lucky to find something 5, 6%, maybe in a country like Germany, but in most very small. And you know, to put that in context, I mean, we think of Google and these tech firms as creating major competition policy challenges, but at the level of the economy, though they're very large, they don't actually, in a sense, in inverted commas, matter. They matter for the industries they're in, but they don't necessarily matter in terms of overall concentration. So in India, as in much of Asia, business groups are largely, as we shall see, family-owned, dynastic, and they're key players. And they're highly diversified. They tend to have very opaque governance and funding. And that opacity, in a sense, is accompanied by concentration in ownership, which in turn facilitates family control and effectively downplaying the role of minority shareholders and the like. And above all, they're very persistent over time. So if you look at numbers from the 1950s to the 90s, the same firm, you know, a significant proportion of the top 20 were there. And although that's changed since 2020, there's still a large, significant number of these business groups that were there in 1950 that are there right now and have grown. So let me move on. Okay. So the object of our paper is to look at dynamics of concentration, market competition over the last 2 decades. We're particularly focused on the scale, weight, and scope of business groups, particularly family business groups in the Indian economy. As you will see, family business groups are the dominant organizational feature. There are a few other business groups, Larsen and Toubro and the like, but essentially family business groups are the dominant group. And we then try and look at some welfare effects, notably vis-a-vis an analysis of markups and therefore profitability. And our data set is going to be familiar to many of you, is prowess. We have a lot of observations, over 500,000 thereabouts. We've had to do an awful lot of data cleaning, however, not least to assign the correct ownership and sectoral affiliations. And as I mentioned already, our focus is on the top 25 business groups, top 25 being calibrated in 2019, 2020 values. Okay, so just for reference, those are the list of characters. So the top 5, for what it's worth, are Reliance, Tata's, Birla, Jindal, and Adani. And obviously, if we roll back the clock to 1950, Tata and Birla would be there. If we roll back the clock to about 2000, then Tata, Birla, Jindal would have been there, and perhaps Reliance, I can't remember. So those are the 25 groups on which we are largely focused. Now, look at how important these groups are relative to GDP. This is overall concentration. So we'll get into the meat of the paper very shortly. So in other words, this is 2001 here on the left-hand side running to 2020. And the green is the top 25, the orange top 10, the blue top 5. So just focusing on the top 5, which I've just mentioned, basically their total revenues to GDP in this period go from about 12% to no, I beg your pardon. They go from about 8% to about
about
7 to 8 or whatever. And the top 25 go from about 12 to over 15 or 16. So let's concentrate on the green. So
revenue divided.
yes,
Yes.
correct.
Value.
Yes.
not value added.
Yeah, it's revenue to GDP. So you can see it peaks in about 2013, comes down again, but at the end point at 2020, it's still significantly above the value that it holds in the start year. Okay, now most of our paper is really using two metrics. One, obviously, the Herfindahl, the second, concentration ratios. They both have their utilities and their values. So if we look at it in aggregate, just all industry, then you can see that the Herfindahl has undoubtedly declined, and quite sharply, for both when you include the state sector, which is the blue line, and when you exclude the state sector. Having said that, you can see that when you exclude the state sector, from about 2015, 2016 onwards, there's an upward tick.
Which area is it here?
This is concentration in India, so it's the Herfindahl
Yes.
index of the whole economy.
Yeah, this is
Yes.
based out of total revenues of the
Again,
firms.
revenue.
Yes,
Revenues,
yes, yes. So
HHI is what?
The Hirschman-Herfindahl.
the
index.
Herschman-Herfindahl index is square.
The
Okay,
square.
yeah,
Measure
yeah,
of-
yes. So what you can see is if you include the state sector, there's an ambiguous downward drift, yeah? There's also downward drift, it would appear, in the private sector, but with a tick at the end. But we'll come back and make this more nuanced.
And it includes all the same sectors though.
Yes, it's
You
at
didn't
the level of
get
the,
rid of the sectors that the state was basically monopolizing.
no, it's everything, okay? So let's concentrate here on the lower things. These are concentration ratios now. So as I mentioned, there are two metrics we apply, the Herfindahl and the concentration ratios. And the top one is for all business groups, but let's concentrate on the bottom, FB5, FB10, and FB25, which are for the family business groups on which we. So these are the concentration ratios over this period. And what you can therefore see, slightly different from the Herfindahl, is that for the 25, it's roughly stable with small upward drift towards the end of the period. And that's pretty much true for both the concentration CR10 and CR5. Now, if you then move down a notch and go to more disaggregated evidence, NIC2, which is, I think, 84 sectors, and NIC3, which we should come to, which is over 200 sectors, then the picture changes somewhat. Remember, if you're looking at the Herfindahl, the normal indicator of a competitive market is somewhere below, as we have it, 0.1, and a reasonably concentrated market is 0.25 onwards. So in effect, from 0.3 upwards, you really have a significant concentration if you consider the HHI measures. And what you see there, however, is that the share of NIC2 industries that are highly competitive, less than 0.1 on the HHI measure, jumps. Well, it increases with a slight downward dip in 2010, but essentially it increases very powerfully from 2001 to 2020. What is important, however, to note is that industries that are very highly concentrated, take 0.5 and upwards, still remain quite significant and account for roughly 16% of industries at the end of the period in 2020. The same sort of story broadly holds when we look at NIC2 industries by CR5 brackets, which includes the state sector as well. So what the story from NIC2 is, there's undoubtedly more competition, but there's also a core of industries where there's very, very limited competition indeed. And the story comes out even more so when we look at NIC3, where it's closer to what you would, at least from a competition policy angle, want to be observing. There you can see that less than 0.1, again, increasing significantly, but also look at the persistence of high concentration sectors, whether using the HHI or the CR5 measure. So what is the summary of this? So declining concentration over the 20 years, driven by the fall in the state sector, i.e. policy induced, but some important nuances. So 85% of NIC2 industries saw a decline in concentration, and that is mainly, which we discuss in the text, through moderately competitive sectors actually becoming more competitive. But there's a core of highly concentrated industries. Turning to NIC3, we find that roughly a third are highly competitive, that's grown, but nearly a quarter are highly concentrated. And that's quite striking, I think. And put it this way, the largest 5 firms controlled over half of revenues in around 15% of NIC3 industries in 2020. So there's it's not exactly a rump, it's because it's too large to be a rump. There is a group of firms where competition really hasn't penetrated in significant ways. Now, I'm going to skip because I don't want to overrun. We started off by observing that these business groups are highly diversified and have always been. So what's happened? In particular, we look at the conjecture. Over these 2 decades, have business groups set about consolidating their market positions in sectors they're already operating in, or have they actually gone on and diversified further? And the answers, as we shall see, are not are nuanced as well. The reality is most FBGs have continued to diversify and at a strong pace, particularly up to 2010, 2012. In fact, the number of industries in which the top 25 FBGs operated actually doubled in the 20 years. And this was true not just of relatively new entrants, the Reliance, Adani, these sorts of people, but it's also very much true of long-standing FBGs like Tata Sons and Birla and the like. And we use in the paper the Jackman measure of entropy, and we show that the diversification is not just across many sectors, but it is mainly across sectors rather than within sectors. So in a sense, it defies some of those models about you wanting to diversify close to what you do using comparable skills. Actually, they're going into lots of new activities. Now, part of this, which we don't really deal with in the paper, but is interesting, is obviously to do with the greater, technical change, structural change in the economy as they move into new activities and the like. But it's also, I think, as I come to, tells us something about their particular strategies that they pursue. Right now, and remember, we at best have T+5, T+10 types of observations, so we can't look over much longer durations, but diversification, when it is pursued by most of these FBGs, does not lead to major market shares being accumulated over the reference period. Now, it's probably too early for that to happen. You don't just jump in and go to 60, 70%. So this may be more incremental, but we document that it doesn't. But having said that, just look at the interesting example of Reliance. 5 years after entry into an industry, Reliance had achieved significant market shares as defined by revenues to total revenues in 4 sectors and small, if not trifling, shares in 13 others. But those 4 sectors' contribution to group performance was significant. So the idea that, they're all just growing incrementally doesn't necessarily hold. It's a slightly more complex picture. Okay, let's come to and wrap it up within the next 5 minutes. So obviously, when you look at market power, competition, and the like, you don't just want to look at concentration ratios. You need to look at pricing and profits. pricing is really very hard to do. And actually profits is very hard to do because these groups are so opaque in their accounting practices and the like. So many bits of them, and they move resources around within. Very, very difficult to do. So we actually have to stick with something that slightly differently calculated, Viral Acharya did in a very nice paper that he published a year back, which is to try and look at a demand side measure of a markup. So here we look at revenues or sales to variable costs. And in the paper, we define what variable cost is, because obviously if you expand the measure, you can obviously change the drift of this, the level of this. And I think it's important that we concentrate on the changes rather than the levels for these caveats. And so what we see, if you like, is that between 2001 and roughly 2012, it's not far off a straight line. There's not much drift. But from 2012-13 onwards, essentially, the markup rises and rises significantly. And at the end of the period, both relative to the trough in 2013 and relative to the start period, markups are significantly higher. And this seems to concur with some of the evidence we see from FBG profitability. We use some examples from Tata's and the like, but there's some recent evidence that we discussed earlier with Payal that is coming out that suggests that profitability has improved quite strongly for the major groups. So to conclude, market concentration declining, although there's been a bit of reversal when concentrating on the private sector post-2015. Disaggregated data, 200 odd sector data, shows significant increase in low concentration industries. That's good news. But there's a block of high concentration industries that remains in place. FBGs have not just concentrated on augmenting their market shares in existing activities, but have very, very actively diversified. Very actively. One should really pay attention to that. And they're mostly diversified across industries rather than within or in proximate industries. And that in itself is really quite interesting. So they've really gone into lots of new things, to put it in a sort of banal sort of way. Most of this as yet hasn't led to the accumulation of large market shares, but it's early. So that may be in the process. And the rise in markups has been quite pronounced since 2012-2013. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the top FBG revenues to GDP have climbed particularly sharply up till 2012-2013, but over the whole period have risen from about 11 to 15%, which is a non-trivial movement in an economy as large as India. Put it in that context, if you did the same calculation for a place like Vietnam, you'd find it might, top 25, it would be way north of 40%. But Vietnam's a small economy, very small relative to India. But for a large economy like India, these are quite striking numbers. Now, of course, these are developments that we have to set in the broader context, sort of preferential treatment, permits or whatever. Permits may not be the right time, licenses, other access to funding, and so on, that many of these FBGs gain. And, some of that is illustrated by the travails and also the documentation that has come up in the last year and a bit about Adani in particular. But he and his group are far from alone, as we, I think, all very well know. So lastly, policy implications. I think, to put this in context, there's been an addiction to large is better. Scale and scope. It's been a model that has been taken on board, not just in India, right through Asia. I mean, it's something the Chinese practice, but it's also something that the Koreans, Malaysians, and the like, everyone is basically going after it. And we shouldn't knock it. Because after all, if you look at the back of the last 70 centuries, where has most growth been? Where has most development been? Well, unambiguously in Asia. So, it would be really crass to say this is a model that has failed. But it's a model that comes with its own drawbacks, which is that you get these business groups with strong political connections that build strong market positions, not least of all by leveraging those connections, and therefore this gives rise to strong persistence entrenchment. It also gives rise to massive wealth inequality. A final point, which is not in the paper, but I just want to mention, the job creation of these business groups is strikingly low. I mean, if you, in our book, we have the numbers, which I forget off the top of my head, but the share of FBG employment to total formal sector employment, put aside all the massive informal economy, is actually not very large. So in all of this, they are tremendously successful in many ways, not least of all in profitability, in wealth accumulation and the like, but they're not necessarily particularly effective levers for development if employment is the metric you're after. Now, in competition, obviously the 2013 Companies Act tried to act on levels and subsidiaries and the like. I think it's well known what the limitations of all that are. And the Competition Agency has indeed opened up, I think in 2021, investigations into 7 sectors and the like. So there is some sort of action going on there. But I want to just sort of fly a kite, really, that most of us think of competition policy as essentially being triggered by the accumulation of market power in particular narrowly defined sectors, and therefore triggering responses that require divestment or divestment, sale or closure of affiliates or subsidiaries that have these properties. But in an economy such as India, or indeed, as I mentioned, right throughout Asia, where overall concentration is so important, and because these large entities in the economy operating across so many dimensions, it may be that we really need, in this part of the world, to start thinking about a more radical approach, which could set maximum market shares, say, triggering divestiture. Now, have there been examples? Well, yes, way back in history, Roosevelt and the like. I think the most recent examples that had some muscle to them, believe it or not, back in the pre-2010 were in Israel when they tried to deal with some of their business groups and were quite effective. So I think that's an additional element to it. So the two sort of complementary levers are antitrust policy in a conventional sense at the level of the sector or the industry and at the firm, of course, and perhaps looking at overall concentration as well, which is not done. And I don't personally think is likely to be done because it won't be politically acceptable, but I think we might want to think that it should be. Finally, just mention one thing. If we're talking about family business groups, it's the one instrument that seems to have some bite that no one's really talking about, except in Korea, following Japan's early example, is the use of successor or inheritance taxes. And this seems to be about the only thing that seems to be pushing, for instance, Samsung. I mean, Samsung is a behemoth. Samsung, the revenues of the Samsung group are about a quarter of Korea's GDP. And Korea's GDP, as you know, is very high. Per capita income is significantly higher than Spain. So it's a behemoth. But it's the only, they've tried over years to break up holding companies, mandate smaller levels, try and deal with subsidiaries, got nowhere, absolutely nowhere. But in the introduction of a quite high inheritance tax, I think it's 45%, seems to be trying to change those incentives, and we'll see. It may even work. I hope I haven't overrun, but thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Simon, for your crisp presentation and for bringing up the questions for discussion. And who better to discuss than Payal, who was till recently with the Competition Commission of India. Payal, you would like to use the lectern or speak from here? Whatever is better for you.
I'll speak from here.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much. Thanks and congratulations to Simon, Saul, Naveen, and Varun. Excellent paper. So when Laveesh asked me to be a discussant on this paper, my first immediate reaction was Viral Acharya and his paper a few years back. And so in some sense, this is an improvement because it goes at a much more granular level, because I think Viral did it for NIC 2 level classification when he showed his concentration numbers. That said, my initial comments would be that when we are sitting and looking at competition cases in the competition authority, the granularity is even far more. And as you're aware, it is prescribed by the law of definition of a relevant market. And the relevant market, which is a definitional and a statutory requirement for finding whether or not there has been an abuse of dominance, or whether or not a certain merger or combination is going to lead to an appreciable effect on competition, the starting point is a relevant market. And the class of, because I was also trying to look at what are the, means I did go back to the data set then, because your paper says that if you're interested in understanding which are the concentrated sectors, the authors are happy to provide. So I'll be happy to get the entire list of those concentrated sectors, because when these cases come before the commission, that is the competition authority, the relevant market, I think, definition, that's where I think there is these disconnect between the economic market and the antitrust market. The relevant market takes into consideration the boundaries in which a particular entity, that is the combining parties or the merging entities, or the entity against whom the abuse of dominance case has been brought before the commission, is a much more legal and an antitrust, though yes, economics comes to bear. So it's more purposive than the kind of database markets which are thrown up by this NIC3 classification and NIC2 classification. So we look into as narrow as chlorine, ethyl alcohol, much more narrower markets when we are looking at competition. So, but that does not take away the macro picture which is coming out of this paper, and how topical it could be, because as you had mentioned, Laveesh mentioned, the headlines of today was about increasing profitability, and you have shown in your paper that there is a correlation between market concentration and markups, and market concentration and entry. So in a macro sense, because a quibble about the data set, which is a very, very rich data set, that is the CMIE data set, at a very granular examination of concentration and diversification trends across a wide spectrum of industries and years. And the measures which have been employed, that is the robust measures, HHI, CR5, and entropy, to quantify concentration and diversification comprehensively. But again, what comes to my mind again and again is the disconnect between then how competition policy, at least through the levers of competition law, because competition policy is not just competition law, and it is a wide spectrum of policies of the government, including trade policy, which can bring in contestability and competition to sectors which were hitherto immune to competition. So it is a much broader area of research and investigation. But if I restrict myself only to competition law, we do start with these numbers, that is these ratios, that is HHI and CR4. But the trend across jurisdictions when enforcing the competition law has been to take them only as a starting point, because there is a significant limitation when it comes to HHI in its sensitivity to market definition. And HHI may not be able to capture the kind of market definition which antitrust bodies have to look into, because they're statutorily required. For instance, in competition law, Section 2 RST clearly define the rules of how a relevant market, relevant product market, and relevant geographic market would be determined. And statutorily, the commissions, not only in India, but all over the world, have to follow that, those principles. Again, 19.5, 6, and 7 also give the various principles for defining these markets. So accurately delineating these relevant markets is crucial, and therefore an overly broad or a narrow market definition can lead to misleading HHI values. So the HHI values are not calculated on the sectoral basis as has been done in this paper. And perhaps that's why I guess competition policy, not only in India, competition law, sorry, not only India, has been far more permissive to concentration than it should have been. So should competition, and so this has come out starkly in when we are dealing with digital sectors, that when you get into just looking at a structural presumption, and structural presumption was something which was an anathema to modern competition law, because modern competition law was supposed to go beyond just these structural presumptions of high concentration numbers, be it in HHIs or CR5 or CR4, actually, that's what we look at. One has to go beyond, and you have to account for potentials of market entry, product differentiation, competitive impact of smaller firms, which can all influence the market dynamics and the concentration figures. So had I got, which I will, of course, on the sidelines get, had I got the sectors which you had identified as heavily concentrated in NIC 3 classification, that is HHI greater than 0.5, I could have then made a correspondence to the kind of cases which have come before the commission, and seen what was the commission's view in those cases, at least in the subsectors or under these NIC3 classification. And of course, HHI, which is not a part of your paper, because I know CMI Provis database is not have enough data for the new age markets or technology markets or service sectors. Over the past 10 years, competition authorities, both in India as well as world over, have moved and have changed their priorities, whether rightly or wrongly. Of course, we can discuss that, priorities, and have moved away from looking at old economy sectors to these new age markets. Though you had mentioned that it's not, perhaps you are a little not too happy about that shift, because you had said that this matters only for industries they are in, and therefore the emphasis has been wrong. But I think there has been a change in the view, because the authorities have seen they're not only impacting the industries where they are in. So in that sense, because the role of digital and technology sectors has not been incorporated in this paper, and why the competition authorities now therefore so there is a dissonance between their enforcement priorities and what your paper suggests, is because there has been economy-wide ramifications of these digital technologies. The latest number of India's digitalization, 20% of India's GDP by 2030 is going to come from these digitalized sectors. And so therefore, these platform industries, this is a side report which is being done by ICRIER, that is the state of the Indian digital economy.
Is that revenue to GDP or value added?
That's revenue to GDP again.
It's double the.
Yeah,
return,
yeah.
At least double.
So the point being that this, why has this emphasis changed not only in India, is because there has been ramifications, though it has been a consumer welfare heaven. These digital markets have really changed the lives of consumers, but the businesses which are dependent on them have been facing the brunt. And in fact, be it on e-commerce marketplaces, be it the advertisers, be it the news publishers, the rise in the advertisement prices, and therefore having implications not only for the publishers, but also for the industries which are dependent on online advertisements, therefore having an inflationary impact. And so studies are being done that whether or not online advertisement has resulted in an inflationary impact on commodities. So that we also need to look into. The other thing which I really wanted to mention was you have brought out two twin forces which have resulted in these concentration of these FBGs, so to speak, is because the composition of the top 25 FBGs has remained largely unchanged, is with long established players like Tata and Birla retaining their dominance while newcomers like Adani having risen. One is the government policies, and second, which you did not mention, but I thought was a very important insight from this paper, was the governance formats of these FBGs, which is really equally important because it is this governance format which is not allowing the discipline of the markets, that is the financial markets and competition so it's a chicken and egg problem. The corporate governance of these family business groups is weak because they don't face competition, and because there is no competition. So it cuts both ways. So the interplay between corporate governance and competition law is not much understood, and so therefore corporate governance improvements could make these industry firms more competitive, but that will only happen if they face competition. And so that in the absence of competition and in the absence of trying to get preferential treatment from the government through policies, be it through, and that's what Viral's paper had talked about, through high tariffs and other ways of getting anti-dumping duties in sectors which are contestable, so to immune themselves from even trade competition is something to actually worry about. Talking about government policies, one part which was, I think, dovetails into this, it is not just the preferential treatment, but it is the concerted efforts to keep small businesses small as well. So it's not just a positive, this thing, but it is also coming from the fact that the small businesses have not been allowed to grow. And while I was doing my research, I got a report which I think Shishir was a part of, that report that is from McKinsey Institute, which talked about India's missing middle, because that's not just a structural anomaly, but also a consequence of systemic factors which has stifled the growth of small industries. Because where else, who will give competition to these 25 FBGs unless the small scale sector is allowed to grow and become reasonably large? So key barriers, of course, are well known, and that report has pointed out very well: low risk appetite among small business owners, uncertain market conditions, and ironically, so on one side we are talking about more regulation through the competition law lever on these industries which are highly concentrated, and hence on these FBGs. But ironically, the small have remained small because of high compliance costs and huge amount of regulatory cholesterol. So it is a legacy as well of how the small scale industry has been treated, and entrepreneurs actually often prioritize stability over scaling, avoiding risks that could jeopardize, of course, their livelihoods. This is coming from the McKinsey report. And the stringent regulations and compliance burdens are disproportionately affect these smaller firms. Whereas the larger firms, of course, have their way around and have a battery of lawyers, compliance officers, etc., to be able to at least checkbox compliances. The smaller firms remain small also because of very well articulated. I mean, this is a group of policy economists who have talked a lot about complex labor laws, high taxation, bureaucratic inefficiencies, which make it more advantageous for firms to remain small. then the report also says, that's the McKinsey report I'm again quoting, by scaling small firms into mid-sized businesses, India could triple the number of large enterprises and substantially enhance economic productivity and job creation. Because you also mentioned these FBGs are not the ones which are also creating employment. Now, just coming to your policy implications, I have no competence to talk about stricter inheritance or successor taxes. I will leave that to someone in the audience or someone else who is more adept in looking at these things. But you advocate imposing limits on market shares held by business groups, potentially mandating breakups when thresholds are exceeded. This we maybe then back to MRTP, that is because that's how MRTP was envisaged, but we have come a long, long way from that, and that would be, I think, very, very difficult in the kind of economic environment where we are in, because I do see that there is a conflict between what you're saying and the industrial policy, because the competition policy always remains in conflict, and there's an increasing conflict between competition policy and the industrial policy, because the industrial policy in India still remains for desirability of scale in driving the development process. That is constant, though I was a little surprised today, and it was so in the morning when I read the newspapers where the finance minister at the CII conference has basically talked, saying that scale is not everything. Does it reflect a recent shift? Because my understanding has been that competition law and competition policy has been highly permissive in the past few years, precisely to encourage scale, and scale for not for itself, again, for geopolitical reasons, for being competitive globally. And that has been the dominant narrative in the Indian policy circles. Scale, building of national champions, regulations such for ease of doing business, etc., has dictated the policy discourse. Because increasingly at the competition authorities, we used to, it's not about direct, because you mentioned about political connections, etc. I will not get into that, but it was an understanding that competition policy and industrial policy, competition policy should be situated in the milieu of industrial policy. So therefore, the mergers and coming back to M&As, because Viral points out about M&As and leading to increasing concentration. First of all, the legislature way back in 2002 had kept very high thresholds for a competition assessment of M&As. And those high thresholds were precisely due to the fact that India wanted, or Indian policymakers or Indian legislature at that time when the Competition Act was enacted. And India has the highest threshold when it comes to competition assessments, when it comes to M&A, so much so we had to fight tooth and nail to bring in another threshold criteria, that is the deal value threshold, which has been just introduced, so that any deal above 2,000 crores would be subjected to competition assessment. Yeah. And last is when you're talking about these coordinated, about this concentration, my worry is that, yes, it is true what your macro numbers are right. It is more due to collusion and coordinated effects rather than just to independent effects, because smallness of these large companies allows for collusion and collusive practices, and competition authority has not come down strongly and heavily upon them. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing us the details of how CCI looks at these issues, right? Because they are, at least I was not aware of these finer details. So the floor is now open for questions from the audience. Mr. Alwari.
Thank you. Thanks, Simon. A very fascinating account. I just want to ask one question. I think Payal mentioned it sort of en passant. You know, to my mind, I mean, the most important thing is trade policy.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think these so-called perpetuation of concentration would have been possible if trade policy had been directed at the principle of increasing competition.
Yeah.
I mean, it clearly hasn't been. I mean, there was initially a kind of general lowering that has got reversed in the last 3 or 4 years. So, all the discussion on competition policy and putting restriction and so on. I mean, the big thing that's missing is trade policy.
Yeah.
That's not actually in the remit
Yeah.
of the Competition Commission. I mean, maybe it should be,
Yes.
but they're not in a position to say
Yeah.
that this is too much, lower the tariff.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that?
Simon, if you don't mind, can we take a couple of more
Yes,
questions?
yes,
and
yes, of course. Yes, yes.
No problem.
So fascinating paper. Obviously, I've not read it. So I have a couple of questions and then 1 or 2 points. But before that, let me segue into my comment by following up on one text thing. Of course, there's a classic example. Korean policy, trade policy was driven by this idea of competition.
Yeah.
That we will in the external sector, but that did not prevent Samsung from being the dominant.
Sure.
thing. So I think it's a much more complicated thing in the Indian context of as well.
Yeah.
But question, if you correct your NIC3 numbers, that at that level, you can separate out into process industries and modular industries. And the story becomes very different when I last looked at it, admittedly 25 years ago. The process industries, which are the petrochemicals, etc. And one classic example to understand the evolution of industrial development in India has been Reliance's story. They started off with fiber, to polyester staple, to the staple, the manufacture, and then the intermediates, the big fight with Usliwadi, I remember.
Yeah.
DMT was. So the question is that once you go to NIC3, you can think in terms of capital intensity, and then the narrative has to change quite a bit, because I think you will find that those are very different types of industry. And it also, my question is, have you looked at it? Secondly, when you make those points about employment, those capital intensive industries, which is where the big guys have to play a role, are the ones which have very little employment. And then this becomes present in what Payal was saying, question of digital industry. So unless you correct those, I'm not sure you can really have a corrected, clear story. Second question, have you looked at the point, these business groups in the European context were present in 3 countries, French, Italian, and Spain. And in those areas, if you remember, the idea of how do you look at concentration, etc., there were papers published in the 80s. So I'm giving my vintage, which talked about the difficulties of with all these indices, especially HHI or the 4-firm concentration issue, in looking at competition, the political economy of competition. I have a lot more, but I'll read the paper.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Please, Renu, we'll collect one more. Renu.
Thank you very much for a most interesting paper. And thanks to Payal Malik for the comments, which were also very enlightening. So I have a few remarks. One is the first one. I don't know whether the paper distinguishes the presence of the top 4 or 5 business houses, because these are in segments where the role of government discretion, these are dominated by natural resource sectors, and the role of discretion in licensing is very important. Because if you do, then your recommendations would also include some checks and balances and spotlighting on that. I can give you one example, and where Reliance's revenues might be distorted. The entry of Geo into the market. I mean, the market share could not essentially have been gained if TRI had not, the regulator had not said that, okay, it was okay. I mean, there was nothing violated if you could just give it away for free. So at least as it played out, two big telecom operators were driven out of the market altogether. So that is one thing. The second is the role of windfall profits in revenues to GDP, particularly, again, Reliance has a very large presence in refining it globally. So there has been a huge rise in commodity prices, which would be not reflected appropriately in deflating by just as a ratio to GDP, because the oil prices after 2016-17 recovered at a much faster pace. So that's a small point. Last of all, on this markups it is a fact that in India, long term, there has been a decline in private final consumption expenditure. And if sales are continuing to rise as a fraction of variable costs, then it might have to do with the top end or the premiumization, because if sales are falling, there is little, firms would not be able to adjust prices this way. So obviously there is a top segment, so it might be related to inequality. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Let him answer and then we'll, yeah. Okay, Simon and Naveen.
Okay. Do you want to go first?
Yeah,
No?
I can
Okay.
take the
Yeah.
trade policy question.
Yes,
Yeah,
okay, fine.
So we haven't looked at trade policy, but I completely agree that it's extremely, extremely important, especially when the problem with our analysis is that we are aggregating at a fairly high level. To get to that connection where we are talking about trade policy and how these big businesses influence trade policies, we'll have to be more granular. For example, if you look at Reliance and how Birlas have been in the polyester staple fiber or the viscose staple fiber industry, they're dominant and they've continuously gamed the trade policy initially through anti-dumping duties and now through quality control orders. And the problem with these is that these guys are upstream, and that has detrimental effects on the entire segment, the entire market, downstream market. And I was recently in conversation with the Tamil Nadu Spinning Mills Association, and they were saying that the quality control order, I'm digressing a bit, but the quality control order was brought in to ensure high quality viscose staple fiber. But what it did is it prevented high quality viscose staple fiber from being imported into India. This is essentially coming from Indonesia. So what you're now using is lower quality fiber, and that has productivity effects and
Is the quality standard different domestically for import?
so what I was told is that now we have to follow the BIS standards, but these industries were already following a more international ISO standard, which was far more, it's internationally accepted, but we didn't need a BIS standard, which requires the inspectors to visit the factories. And what's interesting is that according to the ASEAN FTA, Indonesia, Thailand, which are primary exporters of viscose staple fiber, most of their factories haven't been given this BIS certification, whereas most of the European exporters have been. So the cost of production has gone up. It's affecting the entire downstream market, especially considering that almost all the export market is now man-made fiber based or synthetic fiber based. And it's essentially, it's stifling a fairly large disaggregated employment generating downstream sector. And so if we analyze this in pockets, these get very interesting and the effects become more apparent. But the objective of this paper was to sort of look at things in aggregate. So this becomes interesting when we look at specific products, specific industries and product lines.
Sorry, if I may, sorry. Bilaterals we should have, okay, sorry. Yeah.
Just one other comment.
Yeah, because otherwise we won't be able to take questions from the audience.
Just one other clarification. We're looking at the entire NIC. We're not just focusing on manufacturing. We also have trade. We also have trade and the technology sector as part of the analysis to the extent that they're covered by the CMI prowess. So it's not just an analysis of the manufacturing sector. This would include the technology sectors as well.
Limited. Okay. Okay, let me quickly come in. On Montec, but it's also related to something that Anupam and Payal have also mentioned. We don't look at the trade dimension, and it's an important dimension to look at. But this may not be as well informed as I should be, but my impression is that many of these FPGs are mainly operating in non-tradables. And someone alluded to the difference with Korea. And I would imagine that incidence is endogenous. Huh? I mean, they're operating there because they have advantages to operate there. And the link between Montek's point and Anupam's point, and your point over there, I don't know your name, but yeah, is that actually quite a few of those may be natural resource or sectors where permits or licenses or some form of quite strong regulatory effects are required to operate. So I was saying, Anupam, that linking you on Montek's point, I think if we looked further, which we haven't, we'd probably find that FBGs have a higher incidence of activity in non-tradables. And it's no accident, it's endogenous. And I think that's something that we need to
We actually looked at the NIC2 level of very highly regulated sectors, but we didn't find anything interesting at that level of aggregation. We need to do that at a much disaggregated level.
Yeah.
But then, so that's definitely something for future.
Yes. And we haven't, I mean, we have a breakdown in the paper, but it's only NIC1. So we haven't made any determined attempt to look at what you call process and modular industries. So those are all good extensions. On your point about sort of business groups and families in Europe, I mean, I think in Spain, where I work quite a bit, these have waned over time, as it happens, quite significantly for a variety of reasons. And a lot of those reasons tend to be country specific rather than EU generated. France is a country of its own, of course, because not only are family business, I mean, Monsieur Arnault is now perhaps the richest man in the world, and Monsieur Pinault as well. So these two groups are extremely powerful, but of course the state sector is massive. Anupam and I should say, worked at the World Bank, and I once took a very good Russian economist. We went together to present a paper in Paris, and at the end of it, he said, "Oh, I really enjoyed our stay. It's just like the Soviet Union." And he has a point, or he had a point, and he probably still has a point. One other measure, by the way, that's quite interesting is Sweden, because the Wallenbergs and the like. And what is interesting about Sweden, I sort of begin to connect the dots. Well, it's highly open, highly competitive, and highly redistributive, except in one dimension, which is wealth. There is literally no inheritance or successor taxes. And that is probably the main reason why these groups can continue over time. So it's very susceptible to policy there. I really agree about natural resources and that, because, you know, irrespective of opening up, there are so many bits of the Indian economy where you require some stamp or some approval or some license, whatever you wish to call it, to operate in. And that's clearly going to have an effect on competition. Okay, that Payal made quite a few other points, but maybe I'll come back to them later when we open up.
Sure.
Yeah,
please.
My name is Paranjoy. I had 3 sets of questions.
Right.
There has been, in the US, there's been a history of giant conglomerates being broken up by the law, notably AT&T, Standard Oil.
Yeah.
Now, Viral Acharya's paper that was referred to suggests that the 5 largest Indian conglomerates, Tata, Birla, Reliance, Adani, and Bharti Telecom. He argued in a presentation in March 2023 that not only should they be dismantled to reduce market concentration, but also because they're contributing to higher inflation, core inflation. So I'd like views on that. The second question that I have was about not just natural resources, but infrastructure. We've seen one particular corporate conglomerate, Adani, in the last 10 years, having become the second biggest player in airports, seaports, coal mining, power distribution, power generation, imports of coal, etc., etc., etc. So I'd like your views on this phenomenon in India that we see specifically in the last decade or thereabouts? And lastly, are we moving beyond crony capitalism to a form of oligarchy in India?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the presentation. I just have two very quick questions. If you plot the concentration diagram which you had earlier, along with the welfare effects diagram, which is basically the markup, I don't think that the concentration itself will only explain the idea of the markup, because you see that diagram, it's post 2016. There's very slight increase in the concentration, right? And till 2016, there is a drastic decline, and the markup is still going up. So then there is definitely something more to the story than just the concentration. What could that be? It would be interesting to understand from your viewpoint. And second is, I think, Simon, you mentioned that market concentration has changed post 2020. But that, of course, wasn't there because the analysis was. So can you shed some more light on that? What has really changed post 2020?
Sharath, sorry, in the next round, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether I'm right in my understanding of two graphs over here. One of the graphs where you just showed, I think it was the sales over GDP or revenues over GDP graph, wherein I think I saw that there was a dip in 2013, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, maybe you can go. And I saw this again interesting. Oh, no, I'm sorry. There was a peak in 2013, not a dip, peak. And interestingly, and I see that you're another graph, which is basically sales over costs. That graph, there's a dip in 2013. My curiosity, because I'm looking at micro, why is it that? One case I see that it's higher. The first graphs. Yeah, this one. So this is like, you see the concentration is like highest.
It's peaking at 12.
Yeah, 12, 13, 12, 13. But if you see now the sales over, it's actually dipping. It's the least in 2012, 13. Why is that? I'm just.
Okay.
Sales over average.
Variable cost.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want me to start or you want to go first?
Yeah, So in terms of inflation, I can't make a broad enough argument, but I know specific industries like the viscose staple fiber is one specific. I have some idea about that specific industry where Grasim is not just the biggest, not just the only significant producer of staple fiber in India, viscose staple fiber in India. It claims to be one of the largest in the world. And it's not just in terms of its plants, it's got plants all across the world. And it has dissolving wood, dissolving grade wood pulp interests as far as Canada. So it's fairly international in its nature. Despite that, the quality of staple fiber that they produce, especially in their Karnataka plant, is apparently, this is just from conversations with the spinning mill association. They say that the quality is not up to international standards. That one, and with regulations like the quality control orders, the cost of yarn becomes higher because now you're procuring at a much higher cost, and that sort of percolates downstream. And we also need to realize that the efficiency downstream in India is much lower because it's far more diffused, the scales are much lower downstream. So all of this adds to existing inefficiencies and will clearly impact domestic costs as well as our export potential. The export competitiveness, especially for these sectors which are really price sensitive. Right, so it has not just impacts on domestic prices, but also on our international competitiveness. So, yeah, I think
Okay,
on the others, you can
all right.
you make a comment.
Well, I actually like to comment on Joe's points too. Yes, you refer, as Viral did, to the breakup that was and the structural breaks in policy that were associated with the New Deal and Roosevelt in particular. And that then leads him and others to propose breaking up. But look, I mean, I think breakup has two dimensions to it. One are some efficiency costs as well, and they may not be trivial, so one should be aware of them. But the second point is what the political context is and the conjuncture. So the New Deal came on top of the Great Depression, and it was a feasible political operation. I mean, I'm not sufficiently tutored in the situation here, but I would imagine that that's not the case right now. There really is no appetite for this, and I don't think it's a meaningful. So I think policies, that's partly why we have it in the paper, that don't talk about break up, but breaking down by selective divestiture and pressure on particular pressure points where there may be sort of sufficient coalitions of support to do it, just a sort of political economy point, is a much more feasible approach. So I really, whether rightly or wrongly, we'll leave to one side. I just don't think the sort of Roosevelt type approach is going to fly here, or indeed in most bits of Asia, as it happens. Your question was on Adani, these you know, in extraordinary growth from very humble beginnings, as it were, across a bunch of sectors. Well, you know, there are two questions there. Why the growth, which is your question? Why so diversified? And why this particular business vehicle has been applied? And I think our paper hints at that. The business vehicle is applied because it allows forms of cross-funding, opacity in the matters that function. And secondly, of course, it's very good for connecting with politicians and their dispensation of resources or access to resources and so on. And I think whatever Adani and his group's merits as businesses are, and others will know better than I do, I don't think anyone really thinks that they could have grown across so many sectors so rapidly without considerable political support and preferential treatment. Is it carrying capitalism to oligopoly? Well, possibly, if it continues down this path, yes. Having said that, on paper has a good side to it. It shows that there are more competitive sectors now than there were in 2000. In fact, that's the main story there. So I don't think we just want to hang up or sort of focus only on those sectors which aren't competitive. There's a lot of competition going on. And in many, I mean, I haven't got time in this to explain, in many of these NIC3 sectors, certainly in the NIC2, multiple business groups are competing with each other. There are not that many sectors where it's only, you know, Tata or Fata or whatever who has the space. So there's a great deal of good action going on. So one will hope that will carry the day. On markups and concentration, you're right, but we do have a simple regression in the paper which relates the markup to concentration in the sector, and by and large it goes with one's priors. The markup is higher the concentration. Now, that needs to be explored more, and really we've only just made a start at that. And Sharat's points, I mean, these sort of, I don't think one really should be hung up too much on annual observations. After all, there's both heterogeneity going on here, because after all, a hell of a lot of sectors we're doing either aggregating up or when we're looking at NIC3 or NIC2, but also there may be lags as well. But I agree that there's more to be explained.
Just to add to Simon. So this is the period where we see the NPA crisis sort of emerging. That's clearly part of the dip that we see. And when we go to the markups, the markups are mostly explained by the top 5 and not by the top 25. Right, and this period sees some of the business groups that we are looking at, including the Bianis and the Future Group and the UB Group, sort of doing poorly, and the Anil Ambani Group as well doing poorly. So some of these dips are explained by that, but it's interesting to note that the top 5, that's Reliance as a whole, the Birlas as a whole, the OP Jindal Group, Adani, and the Tatas, they account for most of that drives the entire markup story.
Yeah. Put this in context, those top 5, their incomes, their revenues account for between 60 and 2/3 of total of the 25. Okay, so they have a tremendous weight in this.
Payal, you had an observation?
Yeah, just a few observations, because so many things have been said. What Naveen has been talking about, VSF, both those cases came from spinners associations to CCI, and they were found to be abusing their dominance. So it's not that the competition law has not responded to it. The one point which comes to my mind is with these large companies is also the ability to litigate. So both those cases are still in appeal since 2020, and nothing has come out of it. So though commission had found a clear-cut case of abuse of dominance. So the appeal process, the legal system also is
They were fined as well.
they were fined huge amount of fines, the second largest fine after DLF, because given their turnover, but nothing has happened. Second, on one issue which came up regarding markups. So during COVID, we were asked to look at the WPI index and to see which are the sectors contributing. And so there where what Renu was saying and other people, it was by and large those sectors where the public sector was dominating. Inputs like aluminium, coal, etc., which were feeding into, which go into the, because if you want to look at the inflation, we have to look at some index to see what feeds into that inflation. And the sectors which were feeding into that inflation were the sectors for natural resources and dominated by public sector. On breaking up, other than Standard Oil and AT&T, a bit of disinvestments keep on happening through the merger tool, which does not get so much of media attention. There are divestments happening. For instance, in a gas, Linde Praxair, so they were asked to divest certain plants of theirs. So that does not get so much of media attention. On the issue of ports and on breaking up. So once in the history of the 10 years I have been, the breaking up question came up because the law allows the commission to break up firms, was in the context of Coal India. Because the abuse of dominance was so egregious that that was again a public sector company that this thought came, and of course the law changed, etc., but not much happened despite the change of the law. And regarding ports, airports, etc., the competition, these especially for the ports, there was a competition assessment done by the competition authority. We look at what is known as relevant geographic markets. And it is not just because Adani has got 10 ports or 9 ports or 7 ports. It is within the geography whether or not there are sufficient competition constraints. And it so may happen that there are new greenfield investment on part of Adani, but brownfield otherwise, is that this has not distorted competition in the regular relevant geographic market. And there are just a few firms who would have bought Air India. I wish there was more bidding and Tata did not get it.
Thank you. Last set of questions before we close. Prerna.
Yeah, so I would want to touch upon the upstream and the downstream linkages, because most of these big businesses, form part of upstream and provide inputs to the downstream sectors. So, as you have done the profitability analysis, for these family business groups, it would be worthwhile to see how has it impacted the profitability of the downstream sectors, because these big family business groups would be governing and dominating the prices for key inputs that go into these downstream sectors. So that's the first thing. And second is on their ability to generate employment. But you have said at the same time that they are diversifying, and we have seen like Reliance going into apparels and all of these. So, has it impacted their job creating potential? Because I would assume that as you go into such different sectors, subsectors, it would have like labor intensive sectors, it would have an impact on job creation.
Laveesh, and then I'll exploit
Then I
the,
won't, then I'll
no,
take
that's,
it
then
up.
I'll exploit my prerogative and ask the last question, but please go ahead. And unless someone else wants to ask.
Yeah, so what is a minor quibble? And that's, why do we insist on revenues by GDP? I mean, I think Montek also alluded to this. Just to show a large number, it should be value added, and I know the data you can do it. So that's just a minor thing.
It's noisy.
It's noisy.
Noisy.
While value added is more.
Yeah.
Right?
So if you use value added from ASI or from CMI,
Yeah.
it's noisy. We looked at profits. We tried to look at profits. It's nothing sensible coming out.
No, I'm talking about value added, not profit.
Yeah, value added in the sense of total income minus total expenditure.
Sorry, sorry, guys.
So, okay.
Please
Okay, so
stick to the.
Second, and this is actually coming from, in a sense, from what Reina just said. Given the fact that these new technologies that exist and they are having an impact across all sectors, are we stuck with an old notion of, look within the NIC codes? Should we look at value chains and see how those, how people are dominating whole value chains? And there might be something else that you may get from there. And this is again coming from the example that you just given. Stop there.
Any other question? Okay. So I have one or two, right? And correct me because these are observations based on the presentation and a quick read. I think a lot of debate discussion has been that there seems to be something going on in our these big business houses, big business groups that needs attention or redressal. Now, what is that based on? On that one chart which says markups have increased post 2013 or anything else? Because what is the broad story to my mind? Broad story is concentration broadly has come down and these family business groups have stayed, right? I mean, if you take 5, 10, 25, this is a lot of, they are very, very big. That is a big number. Yeah. So they will not disappear, right? So my question is really that what is the undertone of this conversation because of that one chart which indicates that there seems to be crony capitalism or potential oligarchy, because that needs better explanation to my mind, right? If we talked about digital sectors, right? We know marginal cost of digital sectors is near zero. So if they are dominating sales, then by definition, you will see a rise in markup, right? Without anything else going on. So that I think is one macro question I have, right? Yeah.
Shall I start with that? Okay. Okay, so Raina's question about upstream and downstream industries. Well, that's a very good suggestion. We haven't done it. And I dare say one could. It would be very time consuming, however. Yeah, and that needs attention. Has diversification led to more job creation? Well, I don't know is the answer. Are they more labor intensive, the sectors they've moved into? Again, that could be explored for sure, but we haven't explored it. That wasn't the main point of the paper, but I think it's definitely an angle to go towards. But I'm certainly struck that using data probably from up to 2018, how small the job creation of these big business groups has been historically and presently. So it would be quite interesting to see if there's a discontinuity now. And that obviously would then play back to the whole sectoral composition of these activities and the technologies at work. And then Laveesh's point, you're right. Value added would be better. And I think we did try, but as Naveen points out, it was noisy and clearly it would, I guess the ratio would look different, perhaps lower. New technologies. Yes, but remember, most of the sectors that these guys are operating in are old technologies in inverted commas. So now quite what the balance, the contribution of new technology revenue flows or profits to total is, I don't know, because obviously the data set we're working with doesn't cover them. And I think there's, I mean, you will know much better than I do, Laveesh, whether there's data that we could use to address this issue. But certainly with what we have at hand, we don't have it. But you make a good point, and I sign on to that. And Shishir's, I mean, it's a provocative point you make, but it's right. You know, we should be asking, is it as Anjoy has mentioned, because they just have too much market power? Well, I think Payal's point is that the gaze at which the object of attention for competition policy is not an NIC3 sector, let alone an NIC2 sector, but just going down the chain from NIC1, NIC2, NIC3, you can clearly see that the more disaggregated level, consistent with all one's priors, that there is more market power, as it were, available. And therefore, one would expect that when you go down to the level at which competition policy rightly operates, you'd find yet more power. So I think there are reasons for why this should be on the policy agenda, not just to the competition agency, but more generally. But I do think it relates back to the broader point as to whether in inverted commas, the right development industrial strategy is one that is triggered, as Payal pointed out, on scale. And in a sense, in most Asian countries, let alone here, it's not just, it's scale, and then scope gets bundled into scale. And that in the conventional, you know, you don't have to be a conventional microeconomist to think that you're going to get efficiency and welfare implications when you try and approach it that way. So I think there are really good reasons for why this should be on the agenda, irrespective of whether we're talking about 5 or 10% here or there.
Yeah. It's just to add to that. The primary problem for us when we were doing this analysis was how to consolidate this data. There's far too much data, and I mean, just the challenge was how do you sort of compress all of, I mean, a lot of the findings from I mean, a year and a half's data analysis into a paper. So I think this is just the first pass, and definitely the more interesting things happen in the value chains, and the impact on the economy would be more interesting when we look at the upstream downstream effects, where the upstream is indeed there is dominance of in my limited understanding of these big businesses, and yes, it'll be worth looking at whether they've moved into labor-intensive industries. In terms of what the undertone is, Shishir, I think there is a little bit more to what we do than just the markups graph. What we do is we also we do a decomposition of the overall HHI, right? And try and figure out what component of that is coming from the state sector, what component of that is coming from the family business groups, and what component of that is coming from just the rest of the private sector. And what's interesting is that, well, it's obvious, but the state sector has been declining. Its contribution concentration has been declining. And we see an uptick on the private sector, and most of that is coming from these 25 family business groups. At 10%, I mean, once you of the private sector, 10% of that concentration, overall concentration, is being contributed by these family business groups. So it's not just about markups, it's about how concentration is being shaped in the entire economy as well.
I would just say that 25 is a big number, but I think I need to stick to bilaterals after this session. So
25 as in
FBG, 25 is a big number. Right?
Yeah, 25 is a big number, but most of it is being driven by the top 5. That's also something.
Sorry, wait, yeah.
Once you're done, then.
No, I mean,
Okay, so if it's the but there is a totally alternative hypothesis. Economic history tells you that, which is different than the microeconomic industrial organization. which is that the story of business groups is actually does not lie in the product markets. It lies actually in the capital markets. That's the what I was hinting about. French groups, Italian. It's also the story of the keiretsu in Japan and of the chaibols in Korea. So it is really the pooling of capital and the banking system and the financial sector. And that is a unifying story, which also can cover the digital sector today in the West and even in India, if you see where how it's going. So there's that missing dimension, which I think would be good to tie in.
They have mentioned that in their paper.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, one line, but I wish they had worked a little bit more because
That's where.
yeah, they have. And I like that the lack of disciplining force from the capital markets.
Yes.
So, sorry, we are 5-10 minutes past the time. So thanks a lot, Simon, Naveen, again, for bringing this important topic to discussion. Payal for sharing how CCI looks at it. I wonder whether these reports are public or not, right? These things, but it would be, they are.
Yeah, all the CCI
Would be worth looking at.
What's our market studies are everything.
And thanks a lot to everyone for contributing. I think this was a good discussion. To the events and comms team, thanks a lot, folks, once again, for making this happen.